What would drive an angry mob to brutally murder one of the greatest minds of her time? Today, we uncover the incredible rise and devastating fall of Hypatia, a woman who defied the odds to become a beacon of knowledge in a world ruled by chaos. Her story ends in unimaginable tragedy, but what led to it? To truly understand, we must start at the very beginning of her extraordinary life. In the late 4th century, Alexandria stood as a city of extraordinary contrasts. It was a place where immense wealth of knowledge coexisted with the ever-present hum of political tension. Against this backdrop was born Hypatia, a child whose early years offered no indication of the tragic path her life would eventually take. To understand her brilliance, though, we must first understand the unique world of her childhood, shaped by a father whose vision for her future defied the norms of his time. Hypatia's father, Theon, was not a man who fit easily within the constraints of society either. Known as a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, Theon was deeply embedded in Alexandria's intellectual traditions. He was a scholar who prized reason and knowledge above all things. Alexandria offered him access to enormous academic riches, from the scrolls of the famed Library of Alexandria to the discussions of the great minds frequenting its lecture halls. Yet Theon didn't merely see this knowledge as his own inheritance. He saw it as his daughter's as well, an idea that would have raised more than a few eyebrows. You see, in most homes in 4th century Alexandria, girls were destined for lives far removed from books and equations. Their world revolved around domesticity and obedience, while the arena of ideas belonged exclusively to men. For Theon to teach Hypatia to hold her intellectual potential equal to that of any boy was almost revolutionary. He immersed her in the rigorous disciplines of mathematics and astronomy. She learned not simply as a casual observer, but as an active participant. The way Theon trained Hypatia wasn't just about passing on knowledge. It was about nurturing a mind that could question, analyze, and expand upon what it learned. One story from her childhood reveals much about their relationship. It is said that Theon would encourage Hypatia to approach problems from every conceivable angle, no matter how long it took. Once, while they studied the movement of celestial bodies, he asked her an open-ended question. Why do the stars seem so constant in their patterns? Instead of giving her the answer, he waited, quietly, patiently, as she puzzled it through for hours. This atmosphere of curiosity wasn't meant to simply teach her astronomy. Theon was cultivating intellectual courage, the ability to think deeply and independently, even when the answers weren't immediately clear. It's also worth noting that Theon's teachings weren't confined to numbers or the stars. Philosophy played a key role in the education he provided. Hypatia often engaged with the works of Plato and Aristotle at an age when most children were barely learning their letters. Philosophy, for her, was not an abstract pastime. It was the foundation of how she viewed the world. Through these teachings, Hypatia developed a commitment to understanding the relationships between ideas, their implications, and how they influence the lives of the people around her. Yet, there was an undeniable tension in her upbringing. While Hypatia's household echoed with discussions of theories and equations, the city outside remained rooted in traditional customs. Alexandria's streets were alive with merchants, priests, and scholars, but they were also bound by the social restrictions and divisions of their time. Women, particularly, were not seen as participants in the intellectual life of the city, an expectation that Hypatia's education was already beginning to shatter. Still, young Hypatia seemed remarkably unfazed by these limitations. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence Theon instilled in her, or perhaps it was an inherent part of her character. The discipline and structure of her studies didn't stifle her. Rather, they gave her a foundation from which to grow. She would not intimidate easily, not even in the face of centuries-old traditions, that told her she didn't belong in the world of scholars. For her, each equation solved, each philosophical truth understood, seemed to present a subtle but profound challenge to those who doubted her. It's impossible to say when exactly Hypatia's brilliance began to draw the attention of others. By her teenage years, it was clear to anyone who met her that she was no ordinary young woman. She carried herself with quiet assurance, speaking with clarity and depth about topics few of her peers, male or female, could fully grasp. What began as her father's unconventional dream had grown into something far greater. She had become not just an exceptional student, but a symbol of what was possible when the boundaries of society were questioned. But there's something about Hypatia's story in these early years that's almost bittersweet when viewed through the lens of what was to come. Back then, the city's turbulence seemed distant, its conflicts secondary to the pursuit of knowledge within the walls of her family home. She would later become a public figure, standing at the very heart of Alexandria's intellectual world. But that quiet period of growth under her father's guidance planted the seeds for everything she was to achieve. It was her foundation, her beginning, and it shone with promise, untouched by the shadows of the future. So here, we leave this young Hypatia, a girl raised for greatness. The lines of her future weren't yet etched into history, but her remarkable potential was unmistakable. Her childhood had prepared her to speak in a language not limited by gender, religion, or politics. Little could she, or Theon, have known the forces that would one day rise to silence that voice. Yet Alexandria, even in its most fragile state, had provided her with the tools she would need to navigate what lay ahead. But what happens to a promising mind when it steps out of the safety of home and into the charged atmosphere of a divided city? How did this young woman, raised for intellectual pursuits, earn the respect of peers in a world so resistant to her presence? For Hypatia, the quiet walls of her childhood were only the beginning. A much larger stage awaited her, one that would showcase her brilliance, but also expose her to the dangerous tide of events threatening to wash away everything Alexandria once stood for. Envision Alexandria at the turn of the 5th century, a city unmatched in its intellectual prestige. Its streets teemed with merchants, sailors, and scholars, all converging under the towering presence of its lighthouse, a wonder of the ancient world. But Alexandria wasn't just a trading hub, it was a sanctuary for knowledge. The Library of Alexandria may have lost much of its original splendor by this time, but the city was still home to countless academies and places of discussion. The air seemed to vibrate with debate over philosophy, mathematics, religion, and the mysteries of the natural world. At the heart of this flourishing intellectual tradition lay the Neoplatonic school, the successor to the lineage of great thinkers like Plato and Pythagoras. Philosophy wasn't just abstract theorizing here. It was an expansive discipline that sought to understand everything from the mechanics of the heavens to the ethical fabric of human life. This was where Hypatia, now a poised young woman, would emerge, not merely as a student of philosophy, but as one of its most luminous teachers. Imagine the challenge she faced. For centuries, philosophical discourse had been the domain of men. The lecture halls were built to echo with their voices and thoughts, not those of a woman. Scholars arriving from distant lands to learn from the best minds of Alexandria would hardly expect to take guidance from a female philosopher. To many, the idea of a woman standing at the front of a lecture hall, commanding the respect of her peers, seemed strange, if not altogether unthinkable. And yet, there Hypatia stood. She earned her position not through defiance or bold declarations, but through sheer intellectual prowess, the kind that even the most stubborn traditionalists couldn't deny. She didn't fight her way into the spotlight aggressively. Rather, it seemed as if her brilliance made room for her naturally. Her form of authority was quiet, methodical, and rooted in her mastery of the subjects she taught. Teaching at the Neoplatonic school, Hypatia wasn't confined to a single discipline. Her lessons spanned mathematics, where she simplified and expanded upon key theorems, and astronomy, where she helped refine our understanding of celestial motions. But she wasn't just a mathematician or scientist. She was also a philosopher of the highest order, weaving practical knowledge into larger questions about the nature of existence. Her teaching wasn't constrained by dogma or tradition. Rather than providing answers, she encouraged her students to pursue the truth for themselves. Accounts from the time describe her teaching methods as magnetic, her speech clear and compelling. Her students came not only from Alexandria, but from across the empire, drawn by her reputation. And they weren't from a single faction or social group. Christians, pagans, and others all learned side by side in her lecture halls. This ability to inspire diverse groups was a testament to her intellect and neutrality, qualities that allowed her to transcend the social and religious divisions around her, at least for a time. Of course, not all admiration came without skepticism. Whispers about her unconventional position in Alexandria's intellectual world were unavoidable, especially from those unfamiliar or uncomfortable with her success. Hypatia's presence undermined centuries of deeply rooted assumptions about who could hold authority over knowledge. For some, her fame was a triumph. For others, it was a source of unease. In a male-dominated society, Hypatia's growing influence felt like the breaking of an ancient, unwritten code. It didn't matter how respected she became. The very fact of her existence as a philosopher was to some inherently challenging. Even so, her reputation only grew. Over time, Hypatia became more than a respected teacher. She became a symbol of the Neoplatonic school itself. Her presence elevated not only the discipline of philosophy, but also Alexandria's standing as a center of intellectual life. Picture her walking through the city's streets, her students eagerly trailing behind, her voice carrying faintly over the hum of merchants haggling in the market. Her public lectures often drew not just dedicated scholars, but curious observers willing to linger at the edges just to hear her speak. Though she remained focused on her teaching, Hypatia's fame inevitably brought her into contact with powerful figures. Politicians, city leaders, and even figures within the sprawling church hierarchy sought her advice. Among them was Orestes, the Roman governor of Alexandria, whose respect for Hypatia would later play a fateful role in shaping her legacy. To those in positions of authority, her counsel wasn't merely a formality. It was valued, seen as the product of an extraordinary and impartial mind. In a city constantly navigating the tensions between old pagan customs and the rising dominance of Christianity, her neutrality was rare, treasured by some, reviled by others. And yet fame, even for the most gifted, is rarely simple. Hypatia's celebrated position was a fragile one, perched atop fault lines that threatened to fracture the city. The more widely her influence spread, the more resistance it encountered. Resentment often simmered beneath admiration in the hearts of those unwilling to accept a woman as an intellectual equal, let alone a superior. Even among those who admired her, there must have been those wondering, how had she come to embody the city's intellectual tradition? Why her? But questions of belonging couldn't suppress her. Her intellectual contributions earned her the respect of many, including men whose lifetimes had been devoted to philosophy. Unlike traditional educators who guarded their insights, Hypatia saw the spread of knowledge as an imperative. She edited and clarified complex works with the intention of making them accessible to others. Her work on geometry and astronomy not only improved existing theories, but actively paved the way for future discoveries. She wasn't content to merely preserve past knowledge. She sought to illuminate its relevance. Still, it's impossible to ignore the slow-growing shadows that began to form around her. As her influence expanded, those shadows coiled tighter. To her supporters, she embodied the promise of reasoned inquiry, a model of what civilization's greatest minds could achieve. To her detractors, she became something else entirely, a challenge to the established order, a dangerous figure whose growing power must be curtailed. It's unclear whether she noticed the changing winds or whether her focus remained on the intellectual pursuits that had always guided her. In this moment of reflection, it's clear Hypatia's life was far from ordinary. She had stepped into the male-dominated halls of Alexandria and transformed them, earning not just a place but dominance. She faced assumptions about her abilities head-on and dismantled them with quiet precision. Yet, even as she reached unparalleled heights, her growing visibility marked her. This wasn't notoriety born from scandal or arrogance, but from the unavoidable fact that her brilliance thrived where others believed it wouldn't, or shouldn't. Standing at the peak of her career, Hypatia may not have fully understood the growing resentment targeting her. But history reveals it was there, growing in intensity. Her presence in Alexandria remained a fragile triumph. Beautiful, admirable, yet vulnerable. The divisive forces rising within the city would soon converge upon her, pulling her out of her lecture halls and into the heart of Alexandria's conflicts. The streets she once walked so confidently, surrounded by students eager to learn, would soon bristle with tension, because as much as her life was a testament to the heights intellectual achievement could attain, it was also a lesson in how quickly society could turn on those who stood in defiance of its conventions. Her neutrality, once a strength, would become a dangerous liability. The divisions tearing the city apart were closing in, making it clear that even the brightest light could be engulfed by shadows. The world that celebrated her as a scholar would soon come to see her as something quite different. And as Alexandria began its descent into chaos, one question emerged. What happens when a city, once built on knowledge, begins to attack the very figures who sustain it? To answer that, we must follow Hypatia as her intellectual haven collapses around her, thrusting her into a new, perilous role in the troubled city. Picture Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, a city at the crossroads of the ancient world. It was a marvel of human achievement, bustling with merchants trading spices and silk, philosophers debating beneath marble colonnades, and religious leaders preaching to growing crowds. The rhythm of life hummed against the backdrop of unparalleled intellectual brilliance. But beneath this vibrant exterior, there were dangerous cracks forming, growing wider with every passing year. Alexandria, once celebrated as a sanctuary of ideas, was now a city trembling on the edge of chaos. This was a time of profound change. The Roman Empire, once unshakable, was now divided and faltering under its own weight. Christianity, once the faith of persecuted minorities, had now become the dominant religion of the empire, emboldened by imperial support and zeal. Paganism, with its pantheon of gods and centuries of tradition, was quickly fading, and along with it, the temples and rituals that had defined much of Alexandria's cultural heritage. The city's large Jewish population, too, found itself in an increasingly precarious position, caught between these two clashing forces. Religious identities no longer existed side by side in uneasy balance. They collided, feeding an atmosphere thick with suspicion and resentment. Imagine yourself walking through the crowded streets of this divided city. The markets overflowed with the hum of daily life, but tension was never far away. It lingered in the sharp words exchanged at street corners, in the sermons shouted from church halls, and in whispered rumours that crept through narrow alleys. Everyone felt it, a restlessness, an uncertainty about what the future would bring, and a deep distrust of those who believed differently. Power, after all, was no longer shared. It was contested. At the heart of this uneasy coexistence were two men. Cyril, the new Bishop of Alexandria, and Orestes, the Roman governor appointed to maintain order in the city. The two could not have been more different in their ambitions, yet their actions would soon ripple across Alexandria with devastating consequences. Cyril commanded immense influence, preaching to growing Christian congregations and aggressively pushing to consolidate church power. Orestes, on the other hand, represented Rome's waning authority, tasked with overseeing a city on the brink of open conflict. Together, they embodied opposing visions for Alexandria's future, one anchored in the old imperial system, and another driven by a burgeoning religious majority. Between them stood Hypatia. She had no troops, no pulpit from which to rally the masses, no political agenda driving her actions, just her intellect, her influence, and an unshakable belief in the power of reason. In her lecture halls, she welcomed students from all walks of life, refusing to let the city's shifting alliances dictate who could learn from her. Pagans, Christians, and Jews alike gathered around her to hear her speak of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Though the city outside grew more fractured, her classrooms remained spaces of dialogue, rare islands of neutrality in tumultuous waters. But neutrality, no matter how principled, can be dangerous in a city tearing itself apart. To most, Hypatia was a symbol of wisdom, a scholar uniquely devoted to the pursuit of knowledge. Yet extremists on all sides eyed her with suspicion. Her refusal to align with any single faction became a kind of provocation in itself. To devout Christians, her association with traditional Greek philosophy carried the stench of paganism, an identity increasingly maligned as heresy. To others, her friendships with Roman officials, particularly Orestes, placed her in the crosshairs of those vying for political control. Outside the walls of her lecture halls, the fragile balance of power in Alexandria was tipping. Cyril's rise to the position of bishop emboldened Christian factions, who often took matters into their own hands in their efforts to assert dominance. Pagan temples were desecrated, and the once rich tapestry of religious life in the city began to fray. In retaliation, pagan groups responded with sporadic acts of violence, locking the city in cycles of unrest. Orestes attempted to apply the old Roman methods of governance, relying on diplomacy and law to maintain peace. But the cracks in Alexandria's social order were growing too wide to mend. Amid this volatile climate, Hypatia's continued influence became a double-edged sword. Her intellect and public presence made her a respected figure across social and religious divides, but it also placed her squarely between two powers that were increasingly unwilling to coexist. Even her friendship with Orestes, once a mark of mutual respect and collaboration, became a point of contention. As tensions between Cyril and Orestes intensified, the governor relied more on Hypatia for counsel, drawing the ire of those loyal to the bishop. Rumors began to circulate, vague at first, but quickly growing more damning. It was whispered that Hypatia had used her philosophical teachings to turn Orestes against the church, that her lessons contained seeds of heresy meant to undermine the Christian faith. These claims were baseless, but in a city already teetering on the edge of turmoil, the truth mattered less than the perception of truth. Fueled by fear and political ambition, these whispers began to paint Hypatia not as a beacon of knowledge, but as an obstacle to unity, a dangerous figure who stood in the way of the city's religious transformation. Although Hypatia avoided direct involvement in the city's factional battles, she couldn't escape the gravitational pull of its conflicts. Her identity as a philosopher, neutral and reasoned, made her seem aloof to the growing number of Alexandrians who sought clear allegiances during times of upheaval. To those on the extreme ends of the spectrum, her very existence became a problem. In the eyes of her detractors, she wasn't simply an individual. She was a symbol of the old world they were determined to dismantle. You might wonder why Hypatia stayed. Surely she could see the shifting tides. the growing danger surrounding her. Yet there's no indication that she considered leaving Alexandria, the city that had been both her home and the backdrop to her greatest achievements. For all the turmoil brewing at its heart, perhaps she believed in the resilience of its intellectual traditions. Or perhaps she assumed her role as a teacher and thinker would shield her from the conflicts that consumed others. After all, wasn't knowledge supposed to transcend the pettiness of politics and the boundaries of belief? But Alexandria, in this era, was no longer a city guided by its intellectual heritage. It had become something darker, something more dangerous. Religious orthodoxy was tightening its grip, fueled by the insecurities of a city grappling with its identity. Cyril, in particular, understood how to wield the fervour of his followers, using their growing numbers as a source of power. The Jews, once a significant presence in Alexandria, were expelled under Cyril's leadership. Pagan ceremonies were outlawed. The city's famed diversity, once its strength, was collapsing into uniformity through force. The stage was set. The divide between Cyril and Orestes, between religious zeal and imperial moderation, between the old and the new, every conflict seemed to intersect, and Hypatia found herself at the very center. She had no soldiers to protect her, no backing from a powerful institution. All she had was her mind, her resilience, and her refusal to abandon the principles that had shaped her life. And yet, even the most brilliant minds could not withstand the rising tide of fear and resentment forever. Hypatia's independence, once a source of admiration, was now perceived as defiance. Her friendship with Orestes was seen not as an academic partnership, but as evidence of political plotting. The walls of Alexandria, which had once enclosed a city of learning and ideas, had shifted to contain suspicion and hostility. Hypatia became, unwittingly, a mirror for the city's struggles, a figure onto whom people projected their anger, their fears, and their frustrations. Alexandria had reached its breaking point. The city that had once symbolized the pinnacle of human achievement would now descend into conflict, and its brightest light would be extinguished. The world Hypatia had dedicated her life to, the interconnected threads of thought, knowledge, and discussion, was unraveling around her, and as tensions mounted, the precarious line between respect and hatred began to blur. How did Hypatia, a woman who had devoted her life to the search for truth, become so entangled in this dangerous political web? How could her brilliance, revered by so many, also make her the target of such growing hostility? The answers, as chilling as they are tragic, lay not only in her neutrality, but in her humanity. For in a city like Alexandria, neutrality was no longer a refuge, it was a risk. And for someone like Hypatia, whose fairness and intellect set her apart, that risk would soon become a fatal one. But to truly understand how her life unraveled, we must look closer at her bond with Orestes, the connection that would light the spark of her downfall. It is hard to imagine that friendship, a simple connection built on mutual respect, could become a death sentence. But in the fractured, volatile world of 5th century Alexandria, nothing was simple. And for Hypatia, her bond with Orestes, the Roman governor, would become the thread that unraveled the fabric of her life. He was an ally, a confidant, a fellow thinker in a city whose streets bristled with zealotry. Yet, their relationship, or more accurately, how it was perceived, fueled the resentment that would one day cost her everything. Orestes arrived in Alexandria at a time when the city hung in precarious balance. As a Roman official, his role was clear: to enforce law, manage conflicts, and maintain control in a city eroding under the pressure of its own divisions. And yet, in truth, control was something no singular figure could fully grasp. Across Alexandria's neighborhoods and public squares, Cyril, the powerful bishop of the Christian church, was rapidly consolidating authority. These two men weren't natural allies. Their goals were fundamentally at odds. Cyril desired a unified city under Christian dominance, while Orestes clung to the old Roman ideal, governance guided by diplomacy, not religious doctrine. To Orestes, law was law. To Cyril, it was just another instrument to shape Alexandria into the city he envisioned. Caught between these two forces was Hypatia. At first glance, her friendship with Orestes might have seemed innocuous. It was rooted in their shared appreciation for intellect, philosophy, science, and the rational principles that underpinned governance. As a scholar, Hypatia engaged not in the currency of politics, but of ideas. She sought truth, clarity, and understanding in a city clouded by suspicion and fear, and her conversations with Orestes reflected that sensibility. For him, her counsel must have been vital, a rare oasis of logic in a world that grew increasingly irrational. But in Cyril's eyes, their relationship took on a far different meaning. To him, Orestes represented resistance, a Roman hand still clinging to power in a city Cyril sought to reshape. And Hypatia, through her closeness to Orestes, was not just an advisor, she became a symbol. In whispers among Cyril's followers, her title of philosopher blurred into pagan, her belief in reason distorted into a denial of faith. It was a dangerous game of perception, where the truth mattered far less than who was willing to believe the lie. As tensions grew between Orestes and Cyril, each side drew lines in the sand. Complaints became confrontations, and soon their conflict spilled into sharp, unforgettable violence. One day, a Christian faction, angry at Orestes for his opposition to Cyril, gathered in the streets, their tempers fed by sermons that cast the Roman governor as an enemy of the church. When Orestes appeared, they met him with chants, jeers, and escalating fury. What began as a public insult quickly became an outright assault. A leader among the crowd, a monk named Ammonius, hurled a stone, striking Orestes in the head and leaving him bloodied. What followed was an escalation neither man could control. Roman soldiers intervened, seizing Ammonius and executing him, an act that Cyril's followers framed as martyrdom. In response, Cyril began asserting his dominance more boldly, driving Alexandria further into chaos. Orestes, struggling to hold his ground, continued to lean on Hypatia for advice. Their bond, once practical, now became political in the eyes of the public. The mere sight of Orestes walking to Hypatia's home, or conversing with her in the markets, became fodder for rumor and speculation. Whispers turned to accusations, and accusations planted ideas that quickly grew monstrous in communities already primed for division. It was said that Hypatia was the true force behind Orestes' resistance to Cyril, that her lessons and influence had poisoned the governor's policies against the church. Others went further, suggesting that her astronomy and mathematics were nothing more than the trappings of sorcery. In an era where faith clashed with intellect, such claims were not new, but in Hypatia's case, they gained a venom unique to the swirling anger of Alexandria. For Cyril and his supporters, these rumors presented opportunity. Hypatia's independence, her refusal to align with the church or any specific faction, was no longer seen as neutrality. It was framed as opposition. Her wisdom, celebrated for years, became a threat. Her lectures, attended by students of all beliefs, seemed suspiciously inclusive. Her very existence challenged the hierarchical control Cyril sought to enforce. To his followers, Hypatia became more than a person. She was an idea, a disruptive force in a city that, in their minds, longed for unity under the church. And as the rumors spread, they grew darker, spiraling into outright absurdity. Some claimed that Hypatia practiced black magic, controlling Orestes not through intellect or companionship, but through arcane rituals. Others painted her as a puppet master, using her sharp mind to manipulate Alexandria's power dynamics from behind the scenes. There seemed to be no limit to the lengths her detractors would go to tarnish her name. In each accusation, she became less human and more of an enemy, an obstacle to be overcome. Perhaps the most telling part of this entire narrative is how easy it was to target her. Hypatia, for all her brilliance, had no army or political alliance to protect her. What she did have was extraordinary independence, a quality that, in a society growing ever more polarized, left her exposed. Independence that once allowed her to rise as a teacher, respected by all, now made her a perfect scapegoat. She belonged to no religious faction, answered to no institution, and abided by no creed but reason. And in a world increasingly ruled by zeal and fear, independence could look an awful lot like defiance. Even within her own lecture halls, the signs of growing danger must have been impossible to ignore. Did her students notice the way strangers lingered at the edges of their gatherings, watching with harsh expressions? Did she feel the chill of isolation as former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to risk association? Or did she cling to optimism, trusting that reason and moderation would prevail, even as the city seemed to splinter further with each passing day? By the time the falsehoods about Hypatia solidified in the minds of Cyril's followers, they had taken on lives of their own. Her identity had been reshaped by fear, her successes reframed as weapons. To those who once admired or envied her from afar, she now represented a system of thought that stood in opposition to their own. And yet Hypatia herself never wavered. She continued teaching, writing, and forging ahead in the same manner she always had. That quiet strength, though admirable, only hardened her image in the eyes of those who sought to bring her down. Orestes, too, found himself becoming more isolated. His political clout grew weaker, and his clashes with Cyril became more frequent. Though he had the support of the empire on paper, Alexandria had already begun slipping away from imperial control. If Roman officials could only watch as riots consumed the streets, what chance did Hypatia have? It's sobering to think what might have been said behind closed doors during this time. Did Orestes warn her of the growing danger she faced, or did he spare her out of fear that she would step away from his side? Did Hypatia ever consider retreat, or was her belief in the sanctity of knowledge so unshakable that she found herself rooted in place? Either way, the outcome seemed inevitable. In hindsight, it is clear how her independence, coupled with her friendship with Orestes, painted a target on her that left no room for escape. To Cyril's followers, Hypatia was no longer just a philosopher or a scholar. She was the enemy they needed. The conflicts between Orestes and Cyril, which should have remained political, had been transformed into something personal, something visceral, and at the center of it all was a woman who represented the thought, intellect, and neutrality they could no longer tolerate. As Alexandria tightened its grip on intellectual and religious conformity, its capacity for tolerance dissolved, and Hypatia, the brilliant, impartial teacher admired by so many, became the perfect sacrifice for growing fanaticism. The accusations against her did not need to carry truth. They only needed to carry weight, and in the eyes of an angry, divided city, they carried enough. So, how does a city reach the point of consuming its brightest mind? How does friendship turn into guilt by association? And how does a figure like Hypatia become the scapegoat for an entire society's turmoil? These questions linger, their answers buried in the fear and mistrust that ruled Alexandria. But the consequences of this moment were clear. The noose of hostility had tightened, and Hypatia, brilliant, uncompromising, and now entirely exposed, stood at its center, and soon the respect she once commanded would dissolve beneath the rising tide of hatred. The streets of Alexandria carried a peculiar weight now. The chatter of markets, the distant tolling of church bells, Even the wind brushing against the stones of the city, all of it felt heavier, darker. The city's tension wasn't just something you could see in its crowded squares or hear during whispered arguments between neighbours. It was something you could feel under your skin, a growing pressure in the air. And at the very heart of this storm was Hypatia. Once her life had been defined by the pursuit of knowledge. Her days spent lecturing, her evenings working tirelessly to perfect manuscripts or prepare for new ideas to share. All of it had built her reputation as a teacher and philosopher like no other. But that reputation now made her a target. Once admired for her intellect, she had become a figure of suspicion. They called her a pagan, a sorceress, a puppet of Orestes. In silence, her name passed from mouth to mouth in conspiratorial whispers, quickly picking up venom as it spread. The rumours originated from Cyril's supporters, who wielded propaganda with the precision of a dagger. Politics morphed into stories, stories into accusations, and accusations became beliefs. A certain kind of fear took hold, one that thrived on half-truths and flourished in the absence of reason. Hypatia, with her independence, her refusal to submit herself to the church or Cyril's authority, became a perfect scapegoat. The fact that she continued teaching, unbothered by the changing power dynamics in the city, only fanned the flames. To Cyril's followers, her neutrality was unforgivable. It wasn't that she had chosen the wrong side. Her crime was failing to choose a side at all. For her detractors, she embodied what they feared most, a challenge to their authority that couldn't be forced into submission. Her brilliance, her calm intellect, and her refusal to compromise her teachings made her seem untouchable, even arrogant in their eyes. But what they failed to understand was that Hypatia wasn't playing their game. She wasn't contesting power. She wasn't crafting strategies to dominate her enemies. She was simply being herself, a seeker of truth, dedicated to the work that had always given her purpose. And yet, that purity of purpose, that independence, only deepened the resentment against her. The tension reached a breaking point as accusations against Hypatia gained traction. Cyril's supporters accused her of manipulating Orestes, claiming she was the reason behind his resistance to the bishop's escalating power. In whispered circles, they referred to her as a dangerous pagan who clung to the old ways and stood in the way of what they believed to be Alexandria's divine transformation. Whether these accusations were born out of fear or malice mattered little. What mattered was the speed at which they spread, carried on the tongues of those eager for someone to blame. In the streets, people began speaking of Hypatia as if she were an intruder in her own city. They pointed to her study of the stars and mathematics as evidence of sorcery, twisting her devotion to knowledge into something sinister. The image of the respected scholar blurred into a caricature of witchcraft and manipulation. Her tools, once symbols of her dedication to understanding the universe, now became symbols of damnation in the eyes of the growing mob. It didn't matter that Hypatia had never uttered a word against the church or Cyril. It didn't matter that her lectures remained open to people of all backgrounds. What mattered was that the accusations fit a narrative Alexandria had already begun telling itself, that survival required an enemy, and Hypatia had become that enemy. The streets she once walked with quiet confidence now seemed to bristle with unease. Shadows lingered at corners longer than they should have. Eyes followed her, not with admiration, but with judgment. Even in her lecture halls, the tension crept in. Some of her students stopped coming altogether, either out of fear or a shifting allegiance towards Cyril's growing sphere of influence. Those who remained loyal rarely spoke of the dangers aloud, though their worried glances may have said enough. She must have noticed the change. Hypatia was perceptive after all, and the atmosphere around her had clearly shifted, yet she never wavered, never hid. She continued her work as she always had, either too proud to retreat or too optimistic to believe matters could spiral further. But spiral they would. One particular incident fanned the flames of unrest. until they roared into an inferno. It started with a confrontation between Christians and Jews at one of Cyril's churches. The disagreement turned violent as mobs broke into the streets, escalating tensions that had already been at a breaking point for months. In the wake of the chaos, Cyril ordered the expulsion of Alexandria's Jewish community, a brutal move that further divided the city. Orestes, who had publicly opposed Cyril's consolidation of power, found himself isolated and embattled, with allies dwindling as fear of Cyril's influence grew. As the conflict between Orestes and Cyril intensified, the rumors about Hypatia shifted into outright condemnations. No longer was she a mere philosopher, she was described as the source of all resistance to Cyril's authority, the pagan force behind Orestes' defiance. It didn't matter that this was false. What mattered was how easily people believed it. To Cyril's followers, these accusations elevated their cause. They weren't just opposing a Roman governor weighed down by bureaucratic tradition. They were fighting against the forces of darkness, represented by Hypatia. And so the city descended into a slow, suffocating boil. Fear drove neighbors to turn on one another, and anger fed the obsession with purging those who represented challenges to the new order. In this chaotic environment, logic had no purchase. The voices of reason were drowned out by the louder, angrier cries of those seeking someone to blame for Alexandria's pain. It wasn't the crumbling infrastructure of the Roman Empire, or the political manipulations at higher levels, that gave people a sense of security. It was the simpler belief that all evil could be pinned onto a single figure. For Hypatia, this rising tide of hatred must have felt surreal. For years, she had been a symbol of the city's highest ideals: intellectualism, inquiry, and the coexistence of differing beliefs. Now she was cast as their opposite, an object of fear and loathing. How could a life so devoted to understanding the world inspire such hatred? Did she sense her isolation deepening? Or did she hold on to the hope that reason might still prevail? That this storm might pass, if only she kept steady? By the time the city reached its boiling point, it was clear that Hypatia's neutrality would not save her. The forces working against her were larger than anything an individual could counter. She wasn't just Hypatia anymore. She had been made into an idea, a symbol for Cyril's followers to rally against. Whether or not the accusations against her were true no longer mattered. What mattered was the fury they built and the unity they promised to Cyril's supporters. It's unsettling to imagine her life at this turning point. Hypatia wasn't a naive figure, blind to the dangers of Alexandria's unrest. Yet, she likely underestimated the extent to which fear and resentment had reshaped the city she loved. Every quiet moment of her routine, walking through the marketplace, studying late into the night, teaching in the familiar halls of Alexandria's schools, now carried an edge of uncertainty. And yet, she remained. For all the signs that the city had turned against her, she stayed rooted in her work, unwilling to let fear shape her decisions. That choice, as noble as it might have been, was no match for the tides of history. By now, Hypatia's fate was no longer in her hands. It was something whispered in dark corners, debated in mobs, and perhaps even planned behind closed doors by those who saw her as an obstacle. Alexandria's unrest had reached a fever pitch, and the city demanded a scapegoat. In looking for a symbol, they had picked her. Hypatia had risen as a symbol of knowledge, of understanding beyond boundaries. But Alexandria, at its breaking point, had no room left for such ideals. The city's energy had shifted, and the shadow looming over Hypatia could not be ignored. The streets she walked, the very stones she had trodden through years of intellectual triumphs, now led somewhere much darker. Somewhere where fear and hatred drowned out reason. Somewhere that would ensure that Hypatia's voice, so steady and clear, would finally be silenced. The morning must have begun quietly for Hypatia. Though quiet in Alexandria, had long ceased to mean peaceful. The streets of the once great city thrummed with the underlying menace of tension that could snap at any moment. Perhaps she was preparing for another day of teaching, tending to the manuscripts she worked so meticulously to preserve, or walking her familiar path to the Neoplatonic school. Her life's rhythm had always been steeped in routine, the comfort of study, the clarity of numbers, the limitless questions posed by philosophy. But that day, the city's rhythm was utterly different, driven by a pulse of anger, fear, and fervor that made her routines irrelevant. The rumors about Hypatia had reached a fever pitch, stoked carefully and deliberately by Cyril's supporters. An educated woman, whose wisdom towered above even the most prominent men of Alexandria, had become, in their eyes, a monster in human skin. To them, Hypatia was no longer a philosopher or scholar. She was a pagan magician, an agent of corruption bent on opposing the divine order they sought to establish. The whisper of her name became an invocation of rage, and where reason faltered, chaos thrived. Some said the mob began to gather in the streets as early as midday, a crowd of men, their voices growing louder as they fed off one another's anger. Whipped into a frenzy by sermons and whispered accusations, they carried not just weapons but the weight of their fears and resentments. Hypatia stood for something they couldn't fully name, but knew, instinctively, they must destroy. It wasn't just about Orestes or her supposed interference in politics, or even the religious orders she refused to bow to. It was about what she represented. A world where thought, inquiry, and independence lived outside the control of those who ruled through faith and fear. No one knows where Hypatia was when they found her. Some accounts suggest she was traveling home. Others say she had ventured into the streets, unaware of what awaited her. What we do know is that her movements that day were ordinary. An errand, a trip, perhaps a walk along the library's shadowed corridors, all conducted with the confidence of someone who believed her work still mattered, even as the city crumbled around her. Her familiarity with Alexandria's streets had long provided a sense of security. After all, this was her city, the center of her teachings, the place where her mind had flourished and her reputation was forged. But as the mob gathered, the streets of Alexandria became a labyrinth of peril, the walls closing in around her. When they surrounded her, she would have known immediately that there would be no escape. The details of what followed are difficult to write, not only because of their brutality, but because they mark the extinguishing of one of history's brightest minds. She was dragged from her chariot. If she was walking, they might have simply seized her on the open road. But there was no reverence, no respect for the life they were about to take. This woman, who had spoken with such clarity and guided lives with her wisdom, was reduced in their eyes to nothing more than a symbol of all they sought to destroy. They brought her to the Caesareum, a public space once great and revered, now twisted into the staging ground for her undoing. The speed and aggression of the attack were fueled not just by the crowd's hatred, but by the dangerous energy of collective hysteria. Hypatia was stripped, her body exposed, vulnerable, and unrecognizable as the dignified scholar she had been just moments before. It would have been easy to sensationalize these details, to linger on the horror inflicted upon her, but to do so would only shift the story away from what truly matters. What transpired next was not just an attack on a person, it was the erasure of everything she symbolized. The mob treated her body like an object, a vessel for their rage. They beat her with tiles, shards of pottery turned into primitive weapons by hands trembling with hatred. Some accounts say she was torn apart, her flesh and bones ripped by the mob's unrelenting violence. The frenzy overtook them, and in that moment, they ceased to be individuals. They were something else entirely, a force driven not by thought, but by the primal surge to silence anything that threatened their fragile collective identity. The woman who had spent her life lifting others through knowledge was reduced, in their hands, to dust and silence. But it wasn't enough for them to destroy her. Killing Hypatia wasn't sufficient to erase what she meant to the city, so they went further. They took what remained of her body and burned it, an act deeply symbolic in its cruelty. This was no ordinary violence. It was a statement. It was an attempt to obliterate her, to strip her not only of life but of legacy, to turn her brilliance to ash and scatter it so that not even the memory of her could remain. In smothering her flame, they hoped to extinguish everything she had stood for: the power of knowledge, the courage of reason, and the defiance of ignorance. One cannot help but wonder what thoughts passed through Hypatia's mind in those final moments. Did she realize the weight of what was happening? Did she see herself, not just as a victim of rage, but as a casualty of the broader forces tearing Alexandria apart? Perhaps, even in that terrifying instant, her mind worked as it always had, seeking patterns, understanding, clarity amidst chaos. Or perhaps she thought only of her father, of the quiet moments of her childhood when he first opened the universe of knowledge to her with his patient lessons. Did she see those memories as a comfort, or did they sting with the bitter irony of what was now unfolding? When the mob dispersed, there was only silence. The streets that had roared with chaos moments earlier returned to their unnaturally quiet state, and Hypatia, the philosopher who had defied every boundary placed before her, was gone. The library walls she had once walked, the homes she had visited, the lecture halls that had echoed with her voice, all of it remained, but they were empty. Her death marked not just the personal loss of a scholar, but the symbolic loss of a city's greatest ideals. In the weeks that followed, there were no real consequences for her killers. The mob returned to their lives, no doubt justifying their actions to themselves as righteous, necessary, or inevitable. Cyril, whose influence had fueled the violence, consolidated his power further, cementing his place as one of Alexandria's most dominant figures. Orestes, robbed of his strongest ally and already weakened by the relentless tide of religion-fueled politics, faded into history as one of Rome's diminishing governors. But Alexandria was never the same. The city that had once stood as a beacon for knowledge, a place that celebrated the union of cultures, religions, and intellects, was now a city defined by its divisions. The great schools of thought waned, the intellectual light for which Alexandria had long been known, dimming year by year. Hypatia's murder wasn't the sole cause of this decline, but it was a harbinger of what was to come. Her death marked the beginning of the end for an era of learning, tolerance, and reason within the crumbling empire. And yet, despite the violence, despite the attempts to erase her, Hypatia's legacy persisted. Her works may not have survived, her discoveries scattered, her writings lost, but her story lived on, whispered between generations, revived centuries later as a cautionary tale and a symbol of resilience. She became, in death, what she had unknowingly been in life. A symbol of knowledge in a world that so often fears what it cannot understand. Alexandria moved on, its streets no longer echoing with her name, her presence fading into memory. But somewhere in that city, the marks of her life were still there. The students who carried her teachings with them, the cycles of thought she had inspired, the tiny moments of clarity planted in the minds of everyone she touched. Even under the ashes of her death, there was something enduring, an idea that could not be silenced. Knowledge, no matter how fervently it is attacked, remains. And Hypatia, even as her life was reduced to silence, became proof of exactly that. In the wake of Hypatia's violent death, a strange and suffocating silence settled over Alexandria. The streets, which had been alive with the shouts of the mob that sought and destroyed her, fell quiet in the days that followed. Those who had known her, the students who once sat captivated by her words, the scholars who admired her clarity of thought, the citizens who had marveled at her fearless independence, must have felt that this silence was unnatural, even oppressive. It hung over the city as both a memory of what had occurred and a foreboding sign of what was yet to come. Her followers, those who had believed in her teachings and trusted in her wisdom, were left shattered. They had lost more than a teacher. They had lost a compass, someone who had offered a steady, neutral voice in a city awash with factionalism. For the intellectual community, Hypatia had been a cornerstone. It wasn't just her intellect that they mourned, but her humanity, a rare kind of leadership that rested on her ability to rise above petty divisions and focus instead on the search for truth. She had provided a platform for discussion, something that now seemed impossible in a city increasingly shaped by intolerance. Imagine one of her students, perhaps only a day or two after learning of her gruesome death, standing before the lecture hall where she had spoken so often. They might have paused there, unsure whether to enter or turn away. The walls of that space, once filled with her voice, her measured explanations and probing questions, now stood empty. The quiet would have been unbearable, a sharp contrast to the energized debates and discussions that used to define it. And yet, in that emptiness, a seed of something else began to take root. A realization that the world would not be the same without her, and that preserving her memory would become a task of its own. Beyond those who knew her personally, the broader city experienced her death in a different way. For Cyril's supporters, it was a moment of triumph, the solidification of power. The supposed pagan threat, represented in their minds by Hypatia, had been eradicated, and with it, one of the last remaining figures capable of challenging the rise of Christian orthodoxy in Alexandria. Cyril's influence grew stronger, his followers emboldened, while Orestes, isolated and robbed of his most trusted ally, faded into irrelevance. The political stakes of Alexandria's transformation had tilted decisively, and the city found itself on a path from which it could not return. But this transformation carried a cost far greater than either side could fully comprehend at the time. Hypatia's death was not just the loss of one brilliant mind. It marked the decline of a centuries-long tradition that had defined Alexandria as one of the intellectual pinnacles of the ancient world. Her murder was the result of forces that had been at work for years, forces that sought not to understand, but to dominate, to close off inquiry, to replace complexity with simplicity. In silencing her, the mob had unwittingly silenced something larger, a spirit of intellectual curiosity that had helped shape the city's identity. The effects of her death were both immediate and enduring. In the short term, Alexandria's once luminous reputation as a center of learning began to fade. The schools and academies that had served as incubators for advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy saw their influence wane. Scholars who once traveled from across the empire to study there began looking elsewhere, recognizing that the city's cultural landscape was shifting dangerously. The intellectual diversity that had made Alexandria so unique in the ancient world, a place where ideas from Greece, Egypt, Rome, and beyond had mingled and flourished, was narrowing, being replaced by a more monolithic order. And what of Hypatia's works, the manuscripts she carefully composed, the treatises she influenced, the astronomical tables and mathematical theories she refined? Most of them disappeared in the years that followed, scattered or destroyed as the world moved forward without her. Her teachings survived only in fragments, preserved in the writings of her students or filtered through the histories of those who came later. Piece by piece, her intellectual legacy faded, as if her murder had succeeded not only in ending her life, but in erasing the evidence of her contributions. It's almost unbearable to think about what might have been lost, what discoveries, what truths she might have unearthed, if not for that dark day when her voice was silenced. For centuries, her name slipped into obscurity. She survived only in whispers, in the half-remembered stories carried by the rare few who honored her memory. It wasn't until much later, long after the forces of history had reshaped the world in their image, that Hypatia's story began to resurface. During the Renaissance, a period defined by the rediscovery of classical ideals and a renewed interest in the thinkers of antiquity, her name began to rise again. Artists and historians looked back on her life as a symbol, not just of intellectual brilliance, but of what was lost when fear triumphed over reason. She became a kind of icon, her story woven into the fabric of debates about knowledge, religion, and power. In many ways, her death transcended its time, speaking to something universal about humanity's eternal struggle between enlightenment and ignorance. Those who rediscovered her story saw in her a warning, but also an inspiration, proof that even in the darkest moments, the pursuit of truth and understanding was worth the cost. But her legacy also raised questions, and those questions echo across the centuries. Why does knowledge so often provoke fear? Why do those who work to expand our understanding of the world so often find themselves at odds with those who seek to control it? Hypatia's life and death challenge us to grapple with these questions, to confront the ways in which power and knowledge intersect, sometimes with devastating consequences. And yet, for all the heartbreak her story brings, there is something deeply hopeful about what remains. Hypatia's voice was silenced, but her ideals live on, not just in the fragments of her teachings, but in the way her life continues to inspire. She reminds us of the fragility of knowledge, how easily it can be swept away when fear seizes control, but also of its endurance. Ideas, once planted, are not so easily uprooted. They find ways to survive, to grow, even in the most hostile of environments. Picture, for a moment, the world Hypatia might have imagined. A world where intellect isn't constrained by borders or ideologies, where the pursuit of truth is not hindered by fear, and where knowledge is a bridge rather than a battleground. It's a vision that remains relevant, a challenge for all of us to uphold and protect the ideals she lived and died for. And so, even as we reflect on the tragedy of her loss, we find ourselves looking forward, carrying a piece of her legacy with us. Hypatia's story isn't just about an extraordinary woman from a long-lost era. It's about the choices we face, the values we protect, and the convictions we hold in the face of adversity. And in her story, amidst the sorrow and destruction, there is hope. For no matter how dark the moment, the light of knowledge, once kindled, never truly goes out. As we ponder her life, what remains clearest is this: Hypatia's death was a warning, but her ideals are an invitation. She challenges us to rise above the forces that divide us, to recognize the power of reason, and to remember that the pursuit of knowledge, even when met with resistance, is among humanity's greatest endeavors. That is the legacy of Hypatia, and it belongs not to the past, but to every generation willing to carry it forward. Imagine standing in a world where voices like Hypatia's no longer exist, a world where fear devours understanding. Her life reminds us that knowledge, while powerful, is fragile. It demands protection, not just from time, but from ignorance and intolerance. Hypatia's story isn't only a tragedy, it's a call. Every book read, every question asked, every truth sought carries her spirit. Let her courage inspire us to defend reason in the face of division. Her lessons were silenced once, but their echoes remain. And in those echoes, we find hope, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge must always endure. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your voice helps keep stories like Hypatia's alive.